And good evening from the Link NKY World Headquarters in downtown Covington, KY. I'm Michael Monks, and this is the Frankfort Link Live, our season finale, as the 60-day Kentucky General Assembly legislative session comes to an end. As always, I'm joined by Link NKY politics and government reporter Mark Payne, who is at the One NKY House in Frankfort. Mark, thank you for being with us as always.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Lots of good reporting from Mark at linknky.com, especially from these last two busy days of the legislative session, which is, I guess, in its final moments as we speak right now. And we have an esteemed panel of guests to break down what's happened this week and over the course of the entire session. Back for another appearance is Rick Robinson, local author, attorney, political commentator. Rick, thanks for coming back on the program.
Michael, great to be here again. Thanks.
We got another local attorney, former chairman of the Kenton County Democratic Party, and a little legal aid teacher and all those sorts of things. Call Owens, good to see you for the first time on the program.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
Former Kentucky Secretary of State Trey Grayson is with us. Hi, Trey.
Hey, Michael, and happy birthday to Pete Rose. It's his birthday today.
Indeed. And
I got $5 on a bet that said it isn't. So I'm sorry.
And we also have with us NKU Associate Professor of Political Science, Ryan Salzman. Professor, thanks for coming back on the program.
Always happy to be here, Michael. Thank you.
I should acknowledge that this does look like the lamest fraternity chapter meeting ever. And I do apologize for the lack of gender and racial diversity on the panel. We have tried to expand our reach with guests. These are, I know you're all very smart, and I'm grateful for your time today, but we should acknowledge that we are a bunch of white guys talking about this. And as we progress down the road, we will work on diversifying the types of people that we can find. So if you're watching and you're upset about seeing this, please send us some recommendations, because we are looking for more women and more people of color to join our programs and to talk about issues in Northern Kentucky.
Well, volunteer yourself. Like, just reach out. Come on.
Yep.
Absolutely.
All complaints should go to Michael Monks at Link. You can get that online, and you can get his email and say whatever you want to him. Do not email any of us.
Well, I bring this up because
Michael, who agreed to be here.
You know, there are issues facing people of color. There are issues that are significant to women, and we are men who will be talking about them tonight. So I just think it's important that we acknowledge that, and we'll do our best, because these are all good people. This is a good panel. And so with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Payne and just talk about what's been going on the past couple of days, especially in the last few hours, because this is your first year covering the General Assembly, and now you get a feel for what it's like as they race to the finish, either overriding vetoes by the governor or trying to pass some last minute legislation. Tell us what you're seeing right this minute in the halls of Frankfort.
Yeah, Michael, well, we're still waiting, and I think the state is waiting to see if we will pass sports betting. That's been the big topic the past 2 days. Before the veto session, sports betting, which is House Bill 606, which is legislation that would allow folks to gamble online in Kentucky. It was introduced by Representative Adam Koenig, a Republican from Erlanger. It's pretty popular legislation. You know, it would allow folks to go online to Barstool Sports or bet on games without having to drive across the border to Indiana or Ohio to place bets. The legislation seemed like it was starting to die right before the veto period. So in a legislation period, you go through 58 days, and then there's a 10-day veto period where the governor can override any legislation that he doesn't want to do. Then the legislature comes back for 2 days, and they can override vetoes with majorities in both chambers. Both chambers have Republican super majorities right now, so they have a lot of control over what gets passed. And they have spent the past 2 days overriding nearly every one of Governor Beshear's vetoes.
Well, there's a lot that we want to talk about, Mark, because I know that we've spent a lot of time over the past few weeks talking about charter schools, with the Northern Kentucky region being targeted by that legislation, specifically along with Louisville. We'll get to that momentarily. We've just discussed sports betting. Of course, we'll get to cannabis-related legislation a little bit later. But some other significant movements in the legislature include what has been referred to as an omnibus abortion bill. This is something that passed the legislature easily, a Republican-controlled legislature, Republican-dominated legislature. The bill was vetoed by the Democratic governor, and it looks like that veto was overridden. So where does that leave the state of abortion access in Kentucky right now, Mark?
That there are no abortion services being used in Kentucky right now. That is essentially put an end to it. What that law did is it didn't make abortion illegal, but it puts enough in place, and it causes, I guess, it makes it more difficult for these clinics to say that we can provide these services. The state doesn't have systems in place that would allow to essentially abide by these guidelines that were put in place by this bill. So it effectively ends abortion services right now in Kentucky. Now, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Planned Parenthood filed suit nearly immediately after House Bill 3 was overridden. They are seeking injunctive relief, which would allow them temporarily to continue to provide abortion services until this case can go to court. So that's where we're at right now, but abortion in Kentucky is, at least for right now, not being offered.
Let's turn to Cole Owens, former chairman of the Kenton County Democratic Party. Cole, your reaction watching this legislation in particular unfold in Frankfort?
Well, you would pick me, wouldn't you? Not surprising at all, given what's going on across the country right now, change in the United States Supreme Court, people's expectations about what it might do, will probably do regarding Roe v. Wade. I'm kind of a law and order guy myself. I mean, Roe's the law. It has been for 50 years or whatever, but I think it's going to be changed. So this is not surprising. I think it's disappointing to women who, and there are facets of the bill that go beyond problematic to really obnoxious, like having to go to the perpetrator of incest and get their consent, for example, that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, I don't think it's a surprise, and so we'll move forward. I think Mark is correctly, as I understand the litigation that's been undertaken by ACLU and Planned Parenthood, and we'll just see where and how that goes. But I think I guess my final comment would be that the big picture on this is what's going to happen nationally, and because a lot of states are moving to do just this kind of thing.
Let me bring in Trey Grayson for this part too, as well, because Trey, I know that you've been out of electoral politics yourself for a long time, and you've become a keen observer of politics and political science, really. And abortion is just that issue. It's been around for decades. And in spite of like what Cole just said, I mean, it's been law of the land for about 50 years now. What is the motivation? Is it because there are enough politicians in places like Frankfort that truly find abortion to be this immoral act, or is it something that they mostly see as a way to rustle up votes?
I think there's a couple of things here. I mean, one, you go back to the fact that as the country was grappling with the Supreme Court laid down the law in Roe, which prevented the opportunity, it might not have happened, for the country to reach some sort of equilibrium on its own on the issue. I mean, the abortion is fascinating because depending on how you ask the question, make sure you don't take those words out of context. Abortion is not fascinating, but the debate is interesting because surveys show, depending on how you ask the question, you get sort of different results, but there's sort of a consensus that probably some level of restrictions are probably okay if you phrase the questions the right way. But what's interesting about HB3 in Kentucky is that that's a bill that was not a straight party line vote. The abortion bills, since Republicans took over, they now move the bills. For years, the House Democrats prevented abortion legislation from moving. And whenever those bills are passed by the legislature, there are Democrats that vote for those bills, and in both the House and the Senate. And so it is something that they do in a bipartisan way. Interestingly, there's a Northern Kentucky angle this year. Adia Wishner, former state rep from Boone County, after her departure from the legislature, recently became the head of the Kentucky Right to Life Association. So House Bill 3, she was actually very much involved in drafting and putting together the coalition leading up into the session. But it is just, it is this divisive issue. You've got, a lot of people who believe that abortion is murder and there ought to be, you can't have enough restrictions on it. And then there are those who want to preserve the right to choose. It's a debate where each side picks its own words and phrases and languages to try to not only make their own point, but to win the argument, to describe the same thing using, what folks on the left use the terminology of choice and folks on the right use the terminology of life. But it's one of those tough issues. I think Kentucky's a little bit unusual in the sense you do have a fair number of Democrats. I shouldn't say fair. You have Democrats who are elected who generally vote for pro-life legislation. As a country, a lot of the pro-choice Republicans have moved and become Democrats or dropped out of the party or not been as involved. And the same is true with the Democratic Party. There's fewer pro-life Democrats in office. The parties have sort of become one party wants restrictions on abortions and the other one doesn't. And I don't know I don't think the country is in either one of those camps. They're probably somewhere in the middle. And that makes it such a tough issue, such a divisive issue.
I'm going to turn to the rest of the panel momentarily, but Cole, I'll give you an opportunity.
Yeah, just a real quick follow-up. I'm glad Trey said what he said, most of which I agree with, by the way. I think I can tell you from personal experience, being a leader of the Democratic Party up here, as you pointed out, a lot of pro-life Democrats who are a part of this culture in Northern Kentucky. And, they are in the Democratic Party because they support a whole lot of other things. But it really is more of a big tent phenomenon than people think, and a truly a bipartisan phenomenon. So,
Rick Robinson, you worked for Congressman Jim Bunning in a period where the moral majority was rising, and I think about the 80s and the contract with America in the 90s. Can you talk a bit about if there's similarities or differences in the way abortion-related legislation and movements are discussed and debated now compared to that period, or is it pretty much the same?
Well, when I first went to Washington, Michael, back when the Conestoga wagons would take you 18 weeks to get to Washington to start a session, actually the debate was much, much different at the time. Because the debate at that time was, is it a federal issue or is it a states' rights issue? Are we going to schlep it off and talk about it being under the 10th Amendment, or are we going to deal with on a federal basis? And the whole idea at that time was that to some degree, both parties would push off and go, well, it's a state issue. We really shouldn't be dealing with this on a federal level. That was a large part of the argument. And we've evolved from that. Call is very right. And from the standpoint of that, it ends up being not a Republican or Democrat issue. It's actually a different tent that sits off to its own side. I remember the joke in Washington used to be, you could tell when a Democrat was ready to run for president, because they would change their stance on abortion to pro-choice, and they would quit the exclusive man's only Burning Tree golf club. You knew when they gave up their membership at Burning Tree, they were getting ready to run for president, and they were going to flip flop on abortion. But again, it's a tent that existed unto itself. At that point in time, it was states' rights. It's now gone over to probably more of a federal debate than I think anybody would have expected during that time. So it plays into while pro-life, pro-choice played into the election side of it, didn't play as much into the policy side of it. And I think what you're seeing today is that it's becoming both, but it remains that one of those 3 or 4 hot button election issues. This is to rally whatever it is your base is, and call that would be whether we're talking about a pro-life Democrat in a Catholic community, or whether, what it is we're talking about. It becomes that one hot button issue that could swing it. I will tell you that probably over the years, it became less of a knock on door issue. you would get to the point where when you're knocking on the door and you say, you used to get the first only question you would get when you were walking around Northern Kentucky, pro-life or pro-choice. Now they're more interested in, well, what are you doing for jobs? What are you doing for the economy? What are we doing for economic development? Those types of issues come out, and the abortion issue may be a little further down the line for a lot of voters in both parties, called Republican and Democrat, I would say.
Ryan Salzman is an associate professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University and is also with us. Ryan, we heard Rick just talk about how it seemed to be more of a states' rights argument in periods past and then maybe a federal issue. It seems like currently states like Kentucky, other states, primarily in the South, are doing what they can with states' powers in order to trigger something at the federal level. The Supreme Court, for example, exploring options with Roe v. Wade. Is that accurate?
I think so. And I think that we see for years now, probably a good decade, the strategies around the facilities themselves, so to speak, like the requiring that the people who administer abortions or any of that care have to have admitting rights at hospitals. These are things that states have for a long time been able to regulate that isn't necessarily exactly about abortion, because that kind of regulation could apply to any kind of medical procedure. And so, and like you said, this has kind of forced it to come to a head. But what could be interesting to see over the next, call it 5 years or so, we, often when I'm talking to my students, we think about pendulum swinging, and there's all of this built up energy that the states, to your point, Michael, have been, trying to build around this. And then what happens when that dam breaks and the pendulum swings? And we look at some of the policies coming out of states like Texas, where, they've really gone a long way, but they've been held at bay for the most part by Roe v. Wade. But once this goes into effect, well, that ability for, to have citizens, actually, call out neighbors who have done it, make them the enforcers. This is going to institute a whole lot of other things that are going to, it could be a Pandora's box. And I don't know if they're ever going to be able to put all of these back in the box. And I think that it's only a matter of time that until states and state legislatures start saying it doesn't matter where you get an abortion. If you are in the Commonwealth, or if you are back home in the state of Texas, if you go to California to get an abortion and come back here, you could be in trouble nonetheless. It doesn't matter where you get it. And then that's going to really be problematic. So these enforcement issues, and because it's been such a protracted, and it's been very clear that the court has been sort of moving in this direction, at least in terms of their partisan makeup. I know they're not supposed to be partisan, we'll say ideological makeup instead, that then they're going to have, again, these other issues to deal with. I don't know that those will ever, Roe will ever be reinstated in its current form, but that dam breaking could be really interesting. And I wonder, as states like Kentucky continue to pass laws, instead of taking a break and letting the court render its decision, if they run the risk of actually turning some of those justice. I mean, they read the papers, they see what's going on, and it's a very long period of time between when these cases are heard and when the decisions are rendered. And they may start to see some of these possibilities that could be unfolding if Roe is undone. And, you never know these things. The court's so good at and it's built in a way that discretion is able to be preserved. But it does make me wonder if we were to have a surprising result when that opinion is offered, that is, if Roe is upheld, or if some version of Roe is upheld, it does beg the question, is this because the states were going too far and the court said, we can't do this. We can't do this. It's too much built up energy, and we don't know where that's going to go. So, these are more like academic questions. That's what I'm here for, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Michael, can I make a couple more political points just that are more Kentucky specific on this?
Of course.
One is, lost in all this is last year there's an amendment that's on the ballot this fall regarding abortion. How that plays out, does it drive turnout? Does it drive messaging? Joe Fisher, currently a state rep who's leaving office to try to run for the state's U.S. or the Kentucky Supreme Court, he was the prime backer of that. And then the other thing was, we noted that there were Democrats that voted for this bill. The governor vetoed it, obviously, and then he was overridden, and that put the governor in a position where, he's running for re-election next year. Kentucky is a state that probably is, again, it all depends on how you ask the question, but we're probably more on the pro-life side of the side, when you in the aggregate of where people stand than on the pro-choice side. And it forced the governor to probably, to stand more on the pro-choice side. I'm not saying it was done for political, House Bill 3 was done for purely political reasons. I think, there's a lot of committed people who really truly believe in the bill, but it had a silver lining of forcing the governor to issue a veto that I'm sure we'll hear about in the 2023 governor's campaign.
And hang tight, Trey. I'm going to come to you momentarily because we're moving to talk about elections and voting. But first, you are watching the Frankfort Link live from Link in KY. I'm Michael Monks, joined by Mark Payne and Professor Ryan Salzman, and then a bunch of lawyers, Rick Robinson, Carl Owens, and Trey Grayson, who are with us to talk about the Kentucky General Assembly, a lot of the issues that were dealt with down there over the past 60 days, and in particular, their impact on Northern Kentucky. Mark,
hey guys, we could actually road trip the non-lawyers. We could road trip the two press guys. We could throw them in a car and take it where we want.
Sure.
That'd be great.
And Rick, I feel compelled to say, what, lawyers, guns, and money, right?
Lawyers, guns, and money.
Yeah.
And we won't want to say what's about to hit the fan.
Right.
Just want to say we've spent 24 out of 60 minutes talking about abortion. Let's talk about some other things.
We're going to, Cole. I feel like
Right.
this seemed like pretty significant legislation that I don't think got a lot of attention. And as I noted at the beginning, yes, we are 6 guys sitting around talking about it, and we're going to be working on that. But I felt like it needed to be explored.
I'll hear about that, by the way.
Some pretty significant consequences. Mark, we're going to the polls in Kentucky here in just about a month. May 17 is the primary here in Kentucky. There are some local races and some federal races as well for voters to consider. There was also legislation related to elections, and some got the attention of the governor. He didn't like it, and then the legislators overturned it. Talk about the legislation related to elections quickly.
Yeah, there's been a few bills that went through. I don't have the specific numbers off the top of my head, and I can't talk too much about that, but I have been covering kind of what's been going on in Northern Kentucky a little bit as far as like some of the alleged election fraud, because there is Senator Adrian Southworth has been a very outspoken critic of the way that elections have been handled in Kentucky. She's raised a lot of issues with our voter rolls, as well as
is she the one? She's making the rounds with Erlanger City Councilman Stephen Nipper and somebody else, and
correct
the road show
stowing
doubt in the electoral
integrity
process.
tour. Yep. Restore Election Integrity Tour 2.0. She did a few dates this year, and then the Northern Kentucky Liberty Group just brought in Dr. Douglas Frank, who is friends with Mike Lindell, the My Pillow gentleman, and he's also he spoke at quite a few Trump rallies about how the 2020 election was stolen, and he uses a algorithm that says he can show how the election was stolen and how there's election fraud. And there's a lot to unpack, and I'm really interested to see what Trey has to say as a former Kentucky Secretary of State. But yep, there's a lot in there, and there's a lot to unpack.
Well, let me just say this before we move on to Trey, because I do want to talk about elections and the way that I think the 2020 presidential election has led to a lot of conspiracies and doubt about election integrity. Your write-up, Mark, of the Douglas Frank visit got a response from Danny Whitaker, who is a Republican candidate for Kenton County Clerk against incumbent Gabriel Summey, who's also a Republican. And so that is an office that oversees elections in this county. And this is someone who is completely bought in to what Douglas Frank was selling about voter fraud and these sorts of things. And he called your reporting an example of gaslighting. So let me turn to Trey Grayson now. And
Michael, let me, before you turn to Trey, anybody who's watching this and has been to on election night to any of the 3 courthouses in Northern Kentucky that thinks somehow there is fraud in these elections is absolutely so full of themselves that they don't know where they're from. They're from another planet. Now, if you want to talk about going to the West Kentucky and East Kentucky where votes are bought with liquor, fine, let's talk about that. I don't think we should buy votes with liquor. I think there should be a 2-drink minimum. But that is just absolutely so bizarre and so absurd. We shouldn't even talk about it. I'm sorry. We have the 3 best. We have such solid elections in Northern Kentucky. That's just absurd.
But in spite of your perception, and I think most people agree that elections feel safe and secure, there is legislation that seems to be inspired by the doubt that's been spread nationally.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Because
I agree, Mike.
Yeah. So let's turn to Trey Grayson. You were Secretary of State, and like the county clerk here, you oversee elections across the entire state. And it seems like a complete generation ago since you were in office now. I mean, like, so much time has passed.
I do turn 50 on Monday. So,
you were a very young Secretary of State.
So it is like a generation ago. Yeah. And I'm still really involved in election issues. I mean, I work with the county clerk, so I've been really involved. The 4 bills, the election bills that passed this session, I was pretty involved with development and passage and work on this stuff across the country. And so much so that one of the crazy tours referred to me as a Russian spy. So I just wanted to disclose that to everybody. My cover has been blown. I'm a Russian spy. But former President Trump could not handle the fact that he lost. And there are other folks who didn't believe that he lost. And so, yeah, they've been spreading a lot of conspiracy theories, using a lot of big words and a lot of math and not a lot of evidence and not really following the law. Unfortunately, that's caused people to lose confidence in elections. Now, one thing that is true, regardless of who wins, after the 2016 election, we had a lot of Democrats who couldn't believe Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton and spread some conspiracy theories that the Trump campaign had colluded with the Russians to deliver that victory. And the Mueller report showed there's no evidence of that. But we saw similar disparities and confidence in election outcomes that, that's just normal. Your side loses, you run around people who have similar views. You don't run around with people who have maybe less similar views. And so, but it's Trump for the last couple of years has made it into a really big deal. And so you do have it. Yesterday on the floor, Senator Southworth incorrectly described a news report on the floor. And she said that Kentucky had discovered that there was voting systems connected to the internet in Kentucky. None of our voting systems have the ability to connect to the internet. So Damon Thayer called her out on the floor of the Senate, as he's done a couple of times this session. And we do have some candidates running across the state, but it's the bills that were passed this year are some good bills. Kentucky last year made permanent a couple early voting days. We also made our elections more secure by putting some standards in for drop boxes and making sure that there's a bunch of ballot accountability measures. So when ballots are being taken from drop boxes back to the County Board of Elections, 2 parties are there together. And a certain number of locks, since we're doing a risk limiting audit pilot program where we're going to be able to actually sample some votes after each election. Kenton County, Gabe Summey's actually participating in this pilot, which will give us the ability to discover something before certification, so you can actually do something about it. And in any race, not just the ones that are close, where somebody might ask for a recount or an election contest. So Kentucky's done some really good things over the last couple of years. We're going to have more attorney general audits, which are look at all the evidence given to grand juries. They're mandating the paper ballots. I mean, it's a good mix of reforms that have been passed in a bipartisan manner. The governor's veto of the one elections bill is really because of some campaign finance language that he didn't like. It had nothing to do with the election administration part of it. So it's been great working with Democrats and Republicans, with the governor, with Secretary of State, and the 2 political parties to make Kentucky's elections work better over the last couple of years. So we should, as Kentuckians, we should be proud, and we shouldn't be afraid to engage some of the folks who have these questions. But the facts and the law and the evidence are on the side of those to say that these are not stolen elections. These are not votes aren't in the cloud. They're not some server in Europe that some military operative stole with some company, the Chavez conspiracy with Smartmatic and Dominion. There's a lot of stuff that's being thrown around, but we do have good folks and who run elections in Kentucky in a bipartisan manner, all the way down. Cole, have you been on the Board of Elections at Kent County?
No, we of course have a member on the Board of Elections, but
it's baked in. I mean, we got Republicans, Democrats counting the votes together and doing it together. And while all the clerks are Republicans now, Jim Lurson will tell you that he's standing on the shoulders of Jack Snodgrass, who was the longtime Democrat clerk in Campbell County.
Well, I would say very quickly and briefly, again, something going on here, Trey. Something about a common legacy or something. But I agree with most of what you said. Our experience here working with Gabe, in particular, Gabe Summey, county clerk, has been great, both at the Board of Elections level and at the unfolding of the elections. And one of the biggest points of confusion up here, I believe, is that a lot of people don't understand that there are already poll workers at the polls who represent both parties. They totally don't get that. Of course, what the people in the Board of Elections will tell you is one of their biggest difficulties, most difficult tasks, is getting enough people to do that. But they're balanced and always have been and remain balanced. And I think one thing that we've thought is that needs to be better publicized, so people, going, Trey, to some of what you're discussing is, people's assumptions, their fears, how much that's been stoked by the activities of the last year or two. That the more that's understood, the better people will feel about the election process. But it's been good up here.
And Mark Payne, let's talk about some more legislation as this General Assembly session starts to wind down. It's in its final moments. What do they say at the end? I don't know how to pronounce that word.
Tiny die.
And he died.
Tiny die or bust.
Yeah. I'm glad they answered it for me, because I had no idea. I've heard it pronounced a couple of different ways, so I was going to make myself look.
Always go with the Robinson pronunciation. That's a good rule.
Trey, that's a Ludlow pronunciation.
AFL.
And Ludlow is the crossroads of a continent.
Right. I'm sorry. You're right. I should have used the AFL rule. Always from Ludlow. Always followed Ludlow.
Well done. All right. So let's move on to some other pieces of legislation of consequence. And goodness knows we've talked about the charter school legislation here. It passed the legislature, was vetoed by Governor Beshear, and this week the legislature overrode that veto, which sets up Northern Kentucky for this charter school pilot program, along with Louisville, 2 pilot programs here in the state. This week, as things were winding down, Mark, tell us how it all played out.
Yeah, so the big thing a lot of people were looking at was the number of House votes. So when the bill passed, House Bill 9 passed the House the first time, it barely passed. It had a vote total of 51 to 46. And of course, you need a majority to override it. You didn't need a majority the first time. So they needed over 50 votes. Don't quote me on that. And I bet you, I'm sure Trey can correct me. I believe it's 50. But they added another vote 51. This time. So it's 51. So that barely passed. But they picked up an extra vote. So it was 52 this time. It passed slightly more handily than it did last time. And then headed to the Senate, where it passed really easily. And it went through. The override happened, and a charter school is coming to Northern Kentucky.
It's very interesting because while we say a charter school, and we shouldn't say is coming, we this just creates the opportunity for a charter school.
I should add to it's a pilot project. So it's a pilot project.
We also don't seem to know where, and it's interesting to note that it seems to target Kenton County specifically, despite all of the early brouhaha over a certain Campbell County location that the 2 major newspapers in Kentucky started to eat up in conspiratorial fashion. But I guess I'll turn to Ryan Salzman for this one. You live in the River Cities. All the River Cities have their own school districts. Rick Robinson, are you a product of Ludlow High School, for example?
Class of 1976. Thank you very much.
There you go. So the River City schools are all have independent school districts, and these are the ones that have apparently felt most vulnerable to the arrival of a charter school program. Anything you're hearing in particular around the Bellevue community, since you've got your own school district there?
I mean, I have not heard anything specific any more than what we've been hearing for the last, what this has been ever since the House flipped to solid Republican control. This has been a pretty present issue. And, you know, the issues in the River City schools themselves are very persistent. My children go to Bellevue schools and we very much enjoy it. But some of the kind of population trajectories, you know, there's just kind of these sustainability questions that go along with it. But as for this bill in particular, I've actually found that there's been maybe not less talk, but certainly not more, despite the fact that it appeared that we were about to cross that threshold into it being enabled. But maybe some of it's knowing that it was going to go in Kenton County, likely people took solace in. But you know, a lot of people, when they're committed to their local school districts, they're committed to their local school districts. And if they have wandering eyes, they have wandering eyes. And we have so many parochial schools available. And years ago, the amount of support for people that wanted to attend parochial schools has gone up increasingly. So if you want to leave the public schools in their current state, there's been a path out here, you know, for a long time. And I don't know how much a charter school is really going to change that. Now it could get a lot of really positive buzz. And certainly if something happens to one of the River City schools or districts, or somebody's feeling a new sense of, kind of a challenge for their family and their kids, this could be a good option. But all of these things, when you have kids in schools like I do, when you start talking about 2, 3, 4 years down the road, like, what does that even mean? At that point, I'll have a middle schoolers or a middle schooler. I don't even know what that means. And I don't want to think about it. And I think we know that it's kind of day by day when you have kids in schools. And we're still talking about something, but it has finally passed. It will be very interesting to see, because of the efforts that were made in Newport a couple of years ago to create a charter school there, when the first piece of legislation passed enabling this, but without the funding side of things. There was a lot of discussion. And so will there be a very quick, uptake in this, and will that change the dynamic? It would not surprise me at all. But, the Ignite Institute that exists off 275. I mean, there's a lot of creative educational options here in the region. And so they're going to have to figure out where they're going to fit in this and what their sell is exactly going to be. And when you're just trying to make it on SEEK funding, starting up a school is not cheap. And it's still going to be a very heavy lift, in my opinion, to get this started. NKU is supposed to be the initial administrator. Likely the people who I know on Board of Regents are a hard no to this. That's not everybody on the Board of Regents, and I certainly do not speak for NKU, but that could add another issue there as well for getting this up and running. So if there's a school opening its doors in 3 or 4 years, 2, 3, 4 years, again, I'll have a middle schooler at that. I don't even know necessarily what that world looks like. And I wonder if the parochial schools, I'd be curious to know what those parents are thinking as they are cutting checks, even if they're getting support for that. And would this help solve some of those issues? But definitely more questions than answers at this point.
Right. I think you hit the nail on the head of where are they going to fall in the educational in Northern Kentucky? I mean, since I've been a kid, there's not only been Catholic school options, but there's been Montessori schools. There's been this education thing. What's the sales pitch? I don't know. It will be interesting, I think, to see where they fit in.
Mm-hmm. Let me go to Cole on this one, because Cole, you once served on the Covington Board of Education, right? And now you I believe you live in Fort Mitchell and not far from Beechwood. So you've got you've been close to a couple of different independent school districts in Kenton County. And Covington in particular stands in stark contrast to Beechwood, right? I mean, Beechwood is one of the top achieving schools in the entire state academically. Covington is on the opposite end, towards the bottom, one of the worst performing school districts, and has been since you were on the school board. It has been since I was a student there in the 90s. And when I hear Rick talk about what's the sales pitch, what I'm hearing from concerned families and frankly, those making investments in Covington is we lose families when their kids come of age to be in school. Now, I don't know what type of data they have to support those claims specifically, but that's what the belief is. So if the concern is not having a school district that is serving the needs of these families, that seems to be the sales pitch, that a new school coming in independent of the school district while using its money, incidentally, would offer at least a fresh start for a lot of people. What's your take? You should have a unique take on this, given your experience in politics and education.
Well, I thank you for asking. I have a lot of feelings about it. I did serve on the Covington board for 16 years, was elected 4 times from 93, which was immediately after passage of CARA, and the Rose case, up to 2008 when I retired from the board. So I saw a lot go on during those years. The phenomenon you just described about families reaching an age where they had to decide what they were going to do is not a new one. That was in place when I was first on the board and before. Both my kids, by the way, let me say, in the interest of full disclosure, went through the Covington system, are graduates of Holmes, and then went on to higher ed and other things. But and the school system did very well for them. But the idea of people who have the capacity, meaning the economic capacity, to make other choices, either to leave Covington altogether and move out somewhere, or if not to leave Covington, then to at least to move to a different school system, typically the parochial system, for a variety of reasons. You know, they thought the discipline was better. They thought the educational content was better. They love the church. They love their faith, and they want it to be a whole package. But that's not a new phenomenon, and it goes on. Look, the legislation, as I understand it, is very much focused on Kenton County. It's Kenton County alone where the school districts do not have the opportunity to veto this the way that the districts, for example, in Campbell County and other counties do. You know, when I look around Kenton County, I think to myself, I think, Ryan, you said this, the choices are unbelievable. The public choices, the private choices, people already have a lot of choice, and they, believe me, they exercise that choice. As you say, Michael, about, perhaps leaving the community. I guess I have to say from my standpoint, and I think for a lot of other people in the education community that I probably speak for, at least as I understand what they think on Facebook and email and a variety of other things. Henry Webb, for example, the superintendent from Kenton County, went down to Frankfort, and as I understand it, and spoke quite strongly against it. Their concerns are several, but as with many things, much of it comes down to money. You know, how do we fix or improve the public education system by taking money from it? And I want to get in a few minutes, I certainly hope we have time to get to talking about the budget and seek funding and some other things, the tax legislation that is so important. That when that money is gone, that's not going to improve Covington schools to take money from them. I guarantee you that. You know, there might be some parents who feel better about it. I know I'm kind of jumping around here. I do want to say about charter schools, people need to do some research. Look around at the experience. It's not been one-dimensional, but it's not been terrific overall. And it's just too easy for those things to get started, and then things go whatever, and then all of a sudden it's gone. And what do you got left? Kids who are, without a school. And so I probably said enough, but I think the better solution by far, and I say this as somebody who fought a lot of battles down there in the school board, within the system and in the community, is to give them the resources that they need to improve. Now, for example, how curious a budget that everybody in the state gets an 8% raise except teachers, including legislators. I mean, think about that. And you know, I talked to one legislator up here who happens to now be my representative in an interchange, email interchange, and said, you know, what's that about? And she said, well, they've got money. They give raises 1 or 2%. And I'm thinking, come on. So, I mean, you've touched a few live wires here, Michael, but I'll stop just by saying that I don't think this, you know, I don't know what's going to happen. The legislation is there. It's passed. Veto is overridden. It's going to happen. We'll see what happens. But in my judgment, the better thing is to adequately fund the schools. You know, it is true that since 2008 to the present, the SEEK formula adjusted, not formula, but funding adjusted for inflation has declined 30%. That's not hyperbole. That's a true fact.
And just for,
and Michael, if I can jump in real quick,
Let me just finish the sentence. Let me finish my sentence. That's being made up by local funds that local taxpayers aren't thrilled about. You know, that's what we should be fixing, not giving tax breaks to very wealthy Kentuckians, but adequately financing our public schools.
all right, Ryan, go ahead.
to have those the funds, you know, your point, and this idea of this being a very protracted process that's been playing out over a number of years. Was it last session or the session before they passed a law where students can move between districts and take their SEEK money with them? You know, this money is clearly at the center of a lot of this. But again, kind of going back to the point that I made about, you know, so if those things are already in place, obviously a district like Fort Thomas or Beechwood, they can literally say we're closed, we're full, you know, and create their own criteria. Ludlow, I think, is doing excellent in terms of their school district. So it's already enabled that people from Covington could go to Ludlow if they're and take their SEEK money with them in order to do that. So again, this kind of begs the question: what does a charter school give you? Are people just are they going to be willing to take their kids kind of on a lark to do the thing that's kind of unproven, which they may be very interested in doing that.
So Michael, let me jump in here for a second.
Yep.
I've been quiet in part because it's awkward for me because we have a couple clients that have involved in this debate. Like I work, including in KU. I don't want to, it's just awkward to sort of chime in, but let me just point out a couple of just facts about charter schools. I mean, there are 46 states that have charter school laws. So this is not a novel thing that go back to the 90s. More recently, Democrats have been opposed nationally, but Barack Obama was a big supporter of charter schools, remains a big supporter. There's actually several charter schools named after him. And while the quality of the charter schools is not uniform across the country, as Call points out, you know, especially in urban areas, that's where you tend to see the best performance. We have charter schools right across the river in Cincinnati, for example. And I think the pilot program was an attempt, you know, there's an interesting political angle to this, and that in rural Kentucky, which is primarily represented by Republicans now, among the largest employers are school districts. So it was very striking to me seeing when these debates play out, including last year's debate on the education opportunity accounts, how many legislators not just went to their, I mean, obviously most of them went to their local school, right? They grew up in their communities and they stayed there, but married to, parent worked at, you know, kids work at, there's just a lot of ties. So politically, this has been, that's why these votes are so close, because there are a lot of Republicans that felt political pressure back home. And charter schools is probably something that's only going to be in an urban area because you just need to have a critical mass. Plus, again, that's where you've seen the best performance. And so the areas where we're going to have this pilot program, one is in Louisville, you know, and the other is in Northern Kentucky. And I think it is fair to point out is, unfortunately for Northern Kentucky, we have some of the highest performing school districts when it comes to test scores in the state. And a lot of that's driven by socioeconomics, because there's a lot of, you know, income, two parents at home in two districts in particular, two of the three highest ranking districts in the state, in Fort Thomas and Beechwood. And we also have some of the worst performing districts in the sort of the river cities. And so it'll be interesting to see whether there's a demand, but that's just the idea is let's empower parents. This is sort of the argument. Let's empower parents. And there are lotteries, so it's not an application-based system where you have to have a certain score threshold. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, the authorization in this pilot program is fascinating because as Ryan pointed out, NKU has to make a decision by the end of this year what to do. And then it defaults back to a group of Board of Education members from Campbell and Kenton County. I think Representative Wheatley was a little, there is some different language on the role that the Kenton County districts have versus Campbell County, but the pilot program is from urban, it clearly says urban. And so that could be in Newport, and it could be those, that group of parents from a couple of years ago that started, anybody could come in, but that the pilot program should exist. Now, the other thing I don't think anybody's talked about, we could have a lawsuit on this too. And so those deadlines may not hold, but in theory, I think within 2 academic years, we could have a charter school, probably at the elementary school level, but it has to be an urban academy. And this bill was about the funding to allow that.
And I'll just note that there are 9 independent school districts in Kenton and Campbell counties, in addition to the 2 countywide systems. So the 9 independent school districts have about 15,500 students, give or take a few there, 15,500 students across 9 districts, and all that it entails to have those districts. And the question that I've been asking as this debate goes on is, why aren't there better conversations about the way Northern Kentucky delivers education to its kids? As Trey just mentioned, I mean, I from the center of downtown Covington, I can walk to Newport High School, Bellevue High School, Dayton High School, Ludlow High School, and obviously Holmes High School, and barely break a sweat. And all those schools have principals. They're overseen by superintendents. This just seems like a very costly way.
I think the central office, Michael, is the thing that kind of gets me. And actually, usually superintendents are outstanding educators. That's how they rise up to those positions. And I don't want to single any of them out, but it strikes me that paying a superintendent for Newport, for Bellevue and Dayton, even if you just left the schools in place.
About $1 million in salaries between those 9.
Yeah, and what could you do with that millions of dollars? You could raise
15,000 students.
Yeah, you could raise teacher salaries. We could hire reading specialists. I mean, those are some conversations that outside of the charter school, the education opportunity, or helping out parochial schools, that would be some good conversation. That would be some good topics for you guys to dive into and link.
We're going to dive into it. We're running out of time, and Cole Owens is going to get mad at me. So I want to do a quick.
This is the point that I jump in and sing the Ludlow alma mater. I think right now to just stand up for my.
$23 million coming to Ludlow due to the budget this year for a new high school, for a school district, by the way, that has fewer than 900 students.
Wonderful school district that educated wonderful people throughout the years.
Can I speak briefly, Michael?
Hang on, Cole. We're going to come back to you for some final thoughts here.
All right.
Okay, so I want to note, and I'm going to give everybody the chance to just reflect on what they thought were the highlights or the lowlights or a little bit of both from the General Assembly this session. That way, Cole, you can talk a little bit about everything you want very quickly. But first, let's note that cannabis legislation pretty much failed, except for apparently this creation of a commission, possibly, Mark Payne, no recreational marijuana access, no medical marijuana access, although the governor may take executive action at some point. Local Representative Kim Mosier, Republican of Taylor Mills, pushing for, a commission to study marijuana and cannabis. Rick Robinson and I have already volunteered to serve on that commission as
we will be inaugural members of that. They can find us at the Toledo McDonald's anytime they like.
All right, Mark, tell us what the status is of Kim Moser's bill. We posted something moments ago that it passed the Senate, I guess, and was headed back to the House to concur.
The last I heard, it went back to the House concur, and it's law. So there will be a cannabis legislation commission.
But this is sort of like a delay, right? We're going to study cannabis because we don't know what these other states seem to know about cannabis. We have to create a commission based out of UK to take a look at it a little longer to see if it's okay for Mamaw to use.
Yep, and I talked to Representative Mosier this morning because marijuana is going to come up next year in the legislative session too, and I was curious if the commission would be set up by next year and how much research they would have done at that point. And she sounded like she was optimistic that it would be set up and they would have some research done as far as, what potential impact that could have on any marijuana legislation. But it's hard to tell, that's a year away. But any type of cannabis legislation in Kentucky will have to wait at least a year unless Governor Beshear does something, which I'm really curious to see how that plays out, because I don't know how that would work as far as issuing an executive order on cannabis legislation. But we'll see. Next year is an election year, so who knows what happens? All kinds of fun things could pop up.
Rick, disappointing here. A lot of times you hear lawmakers in Frankfort talk about, well, we don't have this thing and surrounding states do have it and we're losing out to them. So let's make an effort to fix that. It seems like cannabis and expanded gambling are the areas that they can't seem to get over the hump in that argument.
Well, and you talk about the highlights and lowlights of the session to me, and it's one of the things that I talk about a lot of times of the changing nature of politics, and I think that is the movement away from all the people that say they want government to be about personal liberty. Of course, it's too important for you to make your own decision. Then we want to make it for you, and I the older I get. With each passing day, the more libertarian I become of just get government out of my life, period. But I think this is one of those issues. You talk about the highlights and the lowlights. That to me is that we are no longer looking at the idea of, what liberty do I want to give up to have government? It's now just a matter of, oh, we're going to believe in liberty. We just don't want you to decide. When there's issues where it's too important for you to decide yourself. And that to me becomes the low life of many legislatures, and whether that's going from Congress down to the Kentucky legislature, that's the problem that I have right now.
Professor Salzman, highlights, lowlights of the General Assembly this year.
I think, Cole mentioned the budget bill, but was it HB 8 with the tax reform bill, I think has probably gotten the least play of anything. And maybe that's because people are in favor of the bill, and that's why it's just not very controversial. So I don't know, maybe that counts as both. Maybe that's the highlight and the low light of the thing, but it's a really interesting idea. And living here in Northern Kentucky and spending time across the Ohio Ocean, and having people consistently hold their biases towards Kentucky, we'll see how much those biases hold when they can all of a sudden, or at least in a couple of years, all of a sudden, start saving thousands of dollars on their income tax, potentially by being just simply on this side of the river. So I think that there's going to be a lot more to say about that potentially as the weeks, as the dust settles or the smoke clears from the session. So I think that's really interesting. And, I think the sports betting and the marijuana, I would say, was positive for both, although I'm sure it's frustrating the way it got to the finish line and, fell just a little bit short. But I am optimistic that both of those are going to continue to develop in future sessions. But yeah, we need to learn more. Mark, I need to know more about HB 8 and what the implications are for me and my family. So whenever you have the time,
All right.
Also,
Yeah,
I have to say,
blunt conversation, Michael, just to
I know.
throw the
And I
last
have to
fun
say,
out for the day. It's a
we
very
haven't-
blunt conversation.
we haven't thanked Mark for having somebody reporting from Frankfurt. I've been able to stop following so many people on Twitter who report.
Okay,
so I
highlight.
can get it.
You're right, Ryan. Highlight of the session.
That's the
We should
highlight,
actually
is
go to our
knowing
own
what's
source.
going on.
Our own
Mark
source
has
for
done a great
political
job.
news.
Yeah.
And Mark and
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
I
Mark and
say
I.
it's a thankless job at sometimes.
It's not thankless. You're getting lots of thanks.
We're thanking you right now,
I know,
Mark.
I know.
So at least you
I
got,
know.
what do we got? 5 people here.
I
saying
appreciate
thank
that. I appreciate that. Yep.
And
Mike,
if you
you
want
for
more time?
me,
Yeah. Let's go to Trey Grayson.
yeah, Mike, and then I'll let Cole have the last word. And
Yeah.
by the way, since Ranger's been talking a lot about Ludlow, Cole and I have to talk about Dixie. We're both Dixie alums.
All right.
But to me, I think and I don't mean this I want to answer this as a straight like news analyst, not as a former, not as a Republican or Democrat or whatever. Well, I'm a Republican, but to me, what's striking is we've seen this
Interesting.
30-year arc of a growing legislative independence. Going back to when Governor Brown's like, yeah, I don't care who the legislative leaders are. And then all of a sudden they like, we can appoint our own leaders. We can have our own committees. We can do what we want to. This year, the legislature introduced a budget before the governor did. And the governor's budget was basically ignored. And again, I don't mean this in an analytical way. I just think from an arc of this legislative independence, really, that's a tremendous change. And I don't think that in 2 years, let's say whether Governor Beshear gets reelected or not, he certainly can be reelected, or whether it's a Republican who's preparing the next budget, really Jason Petrie is going to be preparing the next budget. And that is a big change because everybody's going to be reaching out to the House A&R committee and our own Chris McDaniel. So that I think that's a humongous change. that, and then there were 25 gubernatorial vetoes, I think, in the last couple of days. That doesn't count the redistricting vetoes earlier in the session. So a couple dozen vetoes overridden. I mean, we have a very powerful legislature when they're in charge, when they're in town right now, and they are grabbing onto that power. And I don't think that's going to change even with the Republican governor. I mean, we didn't see this group of Republicans didn't get along with the last Republican governor very well. And so that to me is just that's a sea change in how we approach it. A lot of Governor Beshear's ideas ended up in the budget, to be fair, but it didn't start with his draft, and that's a big deal.
And
I
Cole
don't think
Owens.
John White ever knew what he was giving up, did he, Trey?
No, I don't think he did.
That's why I like
I'm
having
gonna
you
try to-
guys on, because you can do these references and
I'm
hopefully
going to
some
try to
people will.
cover a lot of ground quickly.
Yeah, we've got 20 seconds for you.
So listen up. Some good things. Look, good things happened in odd corners. Medicaid program extended postpartum care coverage from 60 days to 12 months. A great thing, particularly for poor women with lots of issues that addresses. Also provides Medicaid payment for community health workers. I'm a legal aid lawyer at heart. Low-income communities, that's huge. Medicaid required to seek a waiver to cover the severely mentally ill population. Done. Senate Joint Resolution 72. Three great things that don't affect everybody in Kentucky, but affect an awful lot of people in Kentucky in very important ways. Some really ugly stuff. Unemployment compensation. So we squeeze the number of months people are eligible for. We increase the paperwork immensely, and we force them to take jobs at very low pay as a requirement to be eligible. House Bill 4, terrible. House Bill 7, worse, employing immense re-bureaucratization of the issues and ways that we approach people for food assistance and for health care. Again, people dependent on food assistance, what used to be food stamps, and healthcare through Medicaid. I mean, listen, those programs bring, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, anybody else, about 16 or 17 billion dollars into Kentucky and its economy, just in benefits between Medicaid and food assistance. But this bureaucratization is going to do several things. Going to cut a lot of people out of getting the help at all or in a timely way by running them through a bunch of unnecessary paperwork to create this fictional fraud that's out there that people think is, always present in these systems, like some people think it's present in our electoral system. And it's going to cost the state, according to Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, about $250 million, $255 million, just to put all the apparatus in place to do all this unnecessary bureaucratization. So good and bad, beautiful, ugly. That's not the biggest ticket stuff. Swiping $1 billion from taxpayers, or from the state, I should say, and giving it to mostly very wealthy taxpayers, I don't think it's a good idea. I think it should go to education. Thank you.
This has been a good panel. I really appreciate all you guys having some time here to wrap up the Frankfort session. And although this is our last edition of the Frankfort Link Live for this General Assembly session, we are going to be coming out with a new video series very soon that we're revamping. We hope to have some commentary. We'll be announcing that as soon as we figure out what that is. We're working on it now. And so you guys will all hopefully be part of the pool that comes on to talk about it. And we've learned a lot during this process of how to present and how to talk. And thank you so much for that. I want to note that election season is well underway for the primary. LincolnKY.com will have you covered for all the local elections. We have a new special election tab there for where you will find all the stories from Boone, Kenton, and Campbell County. And we will also be hosting several live forums for the primary election coming up in the next few weeks. So be on the lookout for that information. And big news, I know you loved the Link Reader the first time. It came out not too long ago. Our second edition will be in your mailboxes in the first week of May. You'll want to look out for that one. We are focusing on some of our smallest communities, the tiny towns of about 1,000 people or fewer. Why do they exist? Why are they here? Who lives there? Who's in charge of them? And we've got a lot of other great content in there too. So hope you'll be looking forward to that coming to your mailbox in the first week in May. And if you want to learn about Mark Payne's first year in Frankfort, go to lincolnky.com and click on podcast. I interview him on the Kentucky Side podcast that I host every week. And he talks about how he navigated his first time going down there, being thrown to the wild. Mark Payne has done a fantastic job for us. Mark, appreciate you being with us. My thanks to Call Owens, Trey Grayson, Ryan Salzman, Rick Robinson. I know you want to say one more thing, Rick. I can tell.
No, I was just going to start singing the Ludlow alma mater as we closed. I thought.
Well, as we say in the business,
you can mute him, right? Michael, you're the host. Can't you mute Robinson? I
went to Scott, and I think our school song is actually plagiarized, so I'm not going to sing it. All right, that's enough. Frankfort League Live, I'm Michael Bucks. Thanks for watching. Thanks to you guys for being a part of it, and we will see you again soon with the new show. Stay tuned for that.
Thanks, Michael.